welcome to you. I think our online colleagues, we've got about 5 people online at the moment who said they can hear us well and they can also see us. So if we stay in that direction, it's not for Bertha, it's for the camera. So what we're doing here today is we are launching a very important contribution from Melanie Walker and her team. The Mirata project, I'm sure they'll talk about that. I'll just say that this is important for us as well as for everyone who works in the field of student success or in the field of helping our students succeed. It is useful for us to understand our students, and this book also, this project represents the majority of our students in South Africa. So it is valuable for us to understand our students better so that we can adjust our practices to help our students succeed. 3 of the 4 authors, Melanie, Mikateko, and Patience, who's online, is going to do a short presentation for you on the book. I can see the book is already being passed along. There's 2 copies in the room. And then we'll hand over to 3 guest speakers who will provide commentary or response to them. So no further ado, I'll hand over to Melanie.
Okay, thanks very much, Sonja, and to acknowledge Monica McLean, who couldn't be here with us today. And we also had 2 co-investigators in the project, Meredith Wilson-Stradom and Anne-Marie Bathmaker, who weren't able to stay till the end of the project, but our grateful thanks and acknowledgement to them for their contributions as well. So the broad question which informed this project was, how do low-income people from rural areas, and in our case, they came from Limpopo, from KZN, and from Eastern Cape, 3 of the poorest provinces in the country, and townships. A small number came from townships, from Orange Farm or Soweto. And then how do they move from school, access higher education, participate in it, and succeed, and then move on into work? And what are the various enabling and constraining factors for them along this journey? So what we have in the book are detailed case study chapters which show how conversion factors, and I'll explain what those are, present as opportunities or obstacles. For example, low income, rurality, being Black, home language, and individual attributes. And then also the arrangements in universities. And very strong in the data is the importance of relationships working positively or negatively, and they are integral to all the capability domains that we propose. The project is underpinned by a particular view of development, which is broadly summed up in Sen's notion that development means the achievement of the richness of human life as the norm, which should guide higher education, change, development, and transformation. So the book and the matrix, which is quite central to the book, and Mikateko will pick up how this matrix works itself out through individual lives, and Patience will look at some of the practical implications that emerge from it. But in this, we offer a distinctive focus and this matrix for evaluating what people are effectively able to do and to be, that is their capabilities and their functionings. So capabilities are the opportunities to flourish, plus functionings, which we think are really important in the higher education space. And these are the achievements, the plural achievements arising from the capability set which you have. And of course, agency, the extent to which someone is and is able to be an actively choosing subject in terms of the goals they value. So the focus is on capabilities, not only on resources, and I deliberately say only because resources do feature and we come back to them. And then Sen has this notion of conversion factors, which enables you to transform your entitlements, your material and non-material bundle of goods, as it were, into capabilities and functionings. And these will enable or constrain, and they work across contextual, historical, colonial, educational, social, and environmental conditions of possibility for effective capabilities to emerge. So the matrix that we developed is synthetic insofar as it combines normative work, which we draw from the capability approach, and the empirical work, which was the data we collected, the life history data, the survey data, and so on. And we think the matrix offers three possible things to higher education. It can be a lens which you can bring to bear on student well-being, which would enable a deeper understanding of this and of their agency and how universities foster this or not. It could also be a tool so that universities could pick this up as a grid and look at how they might use it to reshape universities to bring them closer to student well-being and agency. And we think it's also aspirational. So we're proposing an aspirational capabilitarian architecture, which is well aligned with constitutional and human development values and with epistemic dignity and repairing freedoms. So the matrix comprises these four elements. There's a capability set with 8 domains. There's a core functioning set in which the functionings correspond to the capabilities and arise from them. There are adequate material resources, and there are contextual and intersectional conversion factors, which are both objective and subjective. And the importance of this matrix is also that it addresses Chrissie, Boughey, and Sue McKenna's criticism of universities as primarily working with the notion of a decontextualized student. In this matrix, the student is very contextualized in all sorts of important ways. So the conversion factors enable or constrain and put together the conditions of possibility. So these would be all the factors that enable or constrain students' access and progress and agency across these intersecting dimensions. They can be seen as indicators of justice and injustice, because if students are not able to exercise well-being and agency, we look at the conditions of possibility which are getting in the way. And in the project, we look both at objective conversion factors, and here we work from secondary data, for example, Stats SA, household survey data, and we generated for the districts and at provincial and national level data across 10 indicators that we came up with, levels of education in a community, levels of employment, and so on. And then there are also subjective factors, what the students told us gets in the way or enables their achievement. And these include a myriad of factors: family income, geography, access to information, the quality of schooling, significant others, the home community, university arrangements, and social capital networks. And depending on a particular student's biography, those conversion factors will intersect in ways which might enable or disable or do both of those things at different points in the student's trajectory. Then very important in the matrix is the notion of the material, precisely because poverty diminishes student lives and their learning. It was very, very clear in the Life History Project that adequate monetary resources to enable students to access and to proceed and to succeed in higher education is absolutely crucial. And we think it's an aspect of decolonization because it requires us to unpick this long durée of rural and township economic exploitation. And just a reminder that Sen, of course, is not against depleted wallets. He thinks they are really important. So just snippets of what the students said. Alawani, who said, "The day I registered, my father was sad, thinking, how will I take you to university?" Or Menzi, who said, "We don't have that much of a research towards how we can access higher education. I find it is as if higher education has built a wall." And Anati, who speaks about feeling shamed by the fact that she could not afford the same kind of clothes as other students in her group, and this made her feel excluded and very, very small. And she asked herself, what was she doing at university? But students also say they were taught by poverty, as they undoubtedly were, but the issue is why? Why do students have to be taught by poverty, and why only some students? Then we have the capability set and the corresponding functionings, and these are broad and vague. It's not a list. There are 8 domains of freedoms which were valued by students for well-being and flourishing, and which also emerged as important normatively. And the 8 functionings we're thinking of as rich learning outcomes, rather different from the global way in which learning outcomes are thought about. And of course, capabilities are dynamic. They can expand and they can be reduced. So the issue is securing functionings and securing capabilities. So our domains are thoughtfully perfectionist insofar as they take a position on social justice in higher education. These are the 8 capabilities and functionings in our set. So we have epistemic contribution, which we think is architectonic to the higher education project. Practical reason, which is planning a life. Navigation, hustling through the university system. Future work and study. Ubuntu, which we think is probably also architectonic. Narrative, inclusion and participation, and emotional balance. So the capability would be the capability to be an epistemic contributor. The functioning would actually be an epistemic contributor. And both of those are important. So one way of organizing it so it doesn't get thought about as a list is that we have these undergirding values of dignity, freedom, and equality, which are, of course, from our Constitution, as well as the capability approach and sustainable human development. We then have these 2 architectonic capabilities, and then the rest are arranged in relation to that. So it's not meant to be a hierarchy, but it's not meant to be a list either. So what I want to do now, and I'm going to have to speed up, is look at these capabilities in terms of the epistemic, repairing, and dignifying. So the epistemic justice capability involves the freedom to be a knower and a teller in higher education, and it's foundational to quality. Initially in the data, it was quite thin. It thickened as students proceeded through their studies, but for some it remained at quite a thin level. So it's very uneven. It's often emergent and elusive rather than obvious in terms of what these students were saying. Then we've got a cluster of 3 capabilities which support human dignity. And we think these are insurgent in that they are against higher education as it currently is, by asserting this dignity as a notion of flourishing. And we think the 3 dignifying capabilities are Ubuntu, narrative, and emotional balance. Emotional balance tended to emerge through what students did not have rather than what they had. So they said things to us like, there's a dark cloud that is on top of my head. One said, I felt like I can't do this anymore, the pressure and fear of failing. And another said, today I feel like I'm suffocating. And then the third group is repairing capabilities. So using Elizabeth Spellman's work, this notion of repairing is acknowledging where we've come from and acknowledging the injustices of the world from which we come, and addressing these carefully in order that we can construct a different future in which we repair past harms and produce and foster a reparative humanness. And the ones we have under repairing are navigation, practical reason, inclusion and participation, and future work and study. And I'm going to hand over to Mikateko to flesh that out a little bit in terms of the students themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start off by sharing with you a digital story that one of the students in the Amartya project constructed for himself. And this is just to illustrate some of the detail that we also managed to capture in the narratives that emerge throughout the second half of the book.
Yeah.
My mother's absence. Let me introduce you to someone. My mother, Even though she is long gone, she is still motivating. She deserves a person, but she got it. My story began on the 9th of December 2010. A day her days were time. Growing up without her was hard, but that change was quite for the better. The absence made me to become the man I am. Trying to do the best I can, working towards success. After social worker, I said, one the day I got to go, she said, putting my education. Remember this, when you step over yourself, you'll be late. You know the difference between them. That's all. And you are fortunate when you're person. I got to campus and saw this different people going around with their business. That day on campus, I met 3 guys, Anne, Theo, and Sonja. We became friends. In fact, we became brothers. We faced challenges together, and we fought them together as brothers. Whenever I see Mikateko about them, they would stare me back in the right way. Mama, I made it. The sun is out and driving. I got Mikateko, but there was no one. The university withheld the city. They said I owe money. How can I owe to the and I asked myself the answer for my grandmother was to learn to allow life. I said,
boy whose mother was not there.
And taught myself how to use the software doing architectural design.
Now, when he graduates, now he made just like me.
My mother never passed matric. The only son passed it for her. She never set foot at any university. Her son got the degree for her. I had a faith and determination that my social opportunity will one day come.
So as we've seen in the digital story, Sipho talks about his aspirations wanting to pursue higher education. We see how important this was to him, how he talks about the importance of doing that, so not only for himself, but for his mother, wanting to kind of break this generational cycle of poverty and the different limitations that have gotten in the way of people in his family accessing higher education. So in the second half of the book, the way in which the chapters are written shows how much we center on students' life histories, despite the fact that we actually use a capabilities analysis on these stories. And we center life histories because they bring home the complexity of the sequences of cause and effect in human lives. In choosing particular courses of action, structural constraints such as economic needs intersect with value orientations, moral obligations, self-determined goals, and the individual's own perception of the situation and choices ahead of them. I'm now also going to read just a few excerpts from the book that again illustrate how we kind of write about these life histories, which we constructed over a 5-year period. So every year we would interview the students. In the first interview, we were talking to them about how they came to be at university and the factors that led up to them accessing higher education. And in every year, we had conversations then about them participating in it, different factors related to teaching and learning, their experiences inside and outside of the classroom, and so on, including right until the last interview where we talked to them about moving on from university. In Matota's story, it begins as such. He was born in 1993 and grew up with his family, his father, stepmother, an older brother and sister, and his nephew. This was in Lusikisiki, a rural village in the Ora Tambo district in the Eastern Cape. His mother had died in 2009, and his father was a bricklayer and worked as a mediator, settling disputes in the local community. His stepmother was unemployed, and his brother a firefighter, while his sister was a road cleaner. As the story progresses, we get to hear about how Madoda accessed university and how he came to participate as well as move on. Towards the end of his narrative, this is how it reads. Between 2019 and 2020, Madoda was employed and looking for work. He had left his CV at several construction projects near his home and surrounding areas, as well as on internet platforms such as LinkedIn. He had been doing part-time jobs such as invigilating exams at a further education college and working as a teaching assistant or assisting clerks in the dean's office at rural university. He attributed his unemployment to a lot of politics, as he put it, and he talked about big guys who employed mostly people in the construction industry controlling everything. Because he lacked connections, he said, Madoda felt that he would not get employed and he would get left behind. He therefore applied for a Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery at 3 different universities. He believed that medicine offered better employment prospects than engineering, which he had studied before, because the government and not private companies were the largest employer in the field. He had researched with which qualifications would enable him to work and get money for the rest of my life, he said. And he thought having 2 different qualifications would give him many keys to opening the door. However, in 2021, he secured a 1-year contract on a road construction project near his home, and he was busy with that when we last spoke to him. So we see from his story how many conversion factors were instrumental for him to achieve the functioning, although it's not secure, of work and employment. His personal characteristics of hard work and diligence, obtaining the degree, and access to technology to apply for jobs were crucial in his case. While the subject field of engineering and labor market opportunities in his home province enabled him to secure a contract job. So none of these stories are identical, and this is what using the capabilities approach as a theoretical lens highlights, because there are various conversion factors that interplay in very unique ways. So it's not given that if people have the same resources at the beginning, that they'll have the ability to convert them into the same capabilities and functionings. So when we read the life histories individually, this illustrates to us why and how accessing, participating, and moving on from university can look very different for individual low-income, rural, and township university students, who nonetheless often had much in common, particularly in terms of having socioeconomic and family backgrounds that were very similar, and also similar experiences of secondary schools, as many of them went to under-resourced schools within quintile 1 or 3. So our capability-based analysis directs us to examine how clusters of material, educational, environmental, social, political, and all of these conversion factors basically working together to manifest as obstacles and opportunities for the achievement of learning outcomes, which Melanie outlined earlier on. And so we do this in order to understand both the reproductive and the transformative potential of university. Another thing that the life histories show is how the matrix is being operationalized, which Melanie described earlier on. So understanding students' biographies through a capabilities lens showed us or allowed us to avoid the monolithic view that all low-income students struggle with the same problems and to the same degree, and that they have the same opportunities to convert resources into similar outcomes. And that's why I was reading out the story that you heard just now. In Madoda's case, he's doing contract work, but there are other students who are moving on to further study, continuing with their master's degrees. Others are still seeking employment, while others are actually still stuck, in inverted commas, in the higher education system. So we see how these conversion factors play out in very unique ways, so that capabilities that we've identified in the research are not being achieved equally by every student. So we consider how these conversion factors variously affect individual students' opportunities for developing multidimensional capabilities and key functionings. And in the narratives that we present, as I said, particularly in the second half of the book, we see then how the Mirato matrix is being operationalized, because we touch on the various dimensions of capabilities, functionings, material factors, and conversion factors to sketch out how these work out and come together in each person's life. An important thing that the narratives do when you read them together is to challenge deficit viewpoints, because we know that international literature on widening participation usually misrepresents working class or low-income students as deficit, high risk, or problematic, particularly because they've usually been to schools where they might not have been prepared adequately for university entry. So our findings challenge this deficit viewpoint by capturing the aspiration, determination, agency, and hard work of students like Sipho, whose digital story that we saw, or Madota, who managed to succeed against the odds. And the narratives also illustrate exactly how these young people are negotiating structural constraints as best as they can. So we acknowledge that we can't know everything about how the personal attribute of being a hard worker is formed, and that the development of this is contingent on various factors, including students' upbringing, their background, their family situation, and so on. So while there are examples of students who could have worked harder, for example, Sonja often said in the first year of university, she wasn't keen on studying education because it's not what she had a passion or interest for, so she found it difficult to kind of will herself to go to class and take her studies seriously. So we see examples of students admitting that they could have worked harder from the beginning of their time at university. But we do not support the idea that hard work and determination are the only factors that determine university success. And the conversion factors and the description of how they play out in individual lives highlight this for us. I'm now going to hand over to Patience, who will talk to us about some key lessons in the book. Just remember to unmute yourself, Patience.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So based on what has been discussed, we came up with key lessons that we can take away from the book. So the book contributes towards conceptualizing and realizing a higher education in which students achieve their qualifications under conditions of human dignity, voice, strengthened agency, and more equality. And removing inequality would ensure that talent is not wasted, intergenerational poverty is interrupted, and social cohesion is advanced. And we also found that advances towards social justice are usually piecemeal, repairing or redesigning parts. Ultimately, policies, and specifically universities' policies, need to be aligned with the normative focus on student flourishing and the wider goal of human development. Mika, can you move to the next slide? Okay, so from the Mirato matrix that was initially explained by Melanie and taken up by Mika, we also realized that it merits discussion towards a sustainable developmental, decolonial undergraduate education and university, and redressable injustices. The matrix aligns well with decolonial approaches and methodologies, and according to Sen's ideas that the approach is open-ended. The matrix grounds policy and process in enabling student self-formation and student flourishing, but capabilities should not be dislocated from their normative underpinning. And to this end, we use both students' voices as well as literature. So while measuring might be challenging and the matrix complex and imprecise, we adopt Sen's idea that it is better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. Thank you. And if I can take an example of the functioning of being an epistemic contributor, we identified inequalities to be aware of, and this is an example of the operationalization of the matrix. So we identified process inequalities. These are related to teaching and learning and relate to who is included and participants effectively in teaching and learning. we also identified horizontal inequalities that are linked to who the student is and who participates in various pedagogical activities with confidence. And finally, we also identified vertical inequalities, which include differences in attainment between groups, race, ethnicity, gender, social groups, and so forth. And being aware of such inequalities, we identified what universities can possibly do. So we did this on 3 levels. Ultimately, from university education, we should ask if university education fostered this capability by encouraging participation in contributing to epistemic materials inside the classroom. And in this regard, students can self-report on how they experience the process of enhancing epistemic contribution. Also, at departmental level, departments can collect evidence on professional development workshops offered in the faculty or centrally, counting who attended, evaluating how effective they were based on self-reporting and more informal discussion, and ascertaining how widespread these are in the department based on self-reporting. Each department can also hold annual focus group discussions with lecturers about teaching and learning practices in the department and what needs to change. Also, students can be asked questions relating to supporting functionings of the capability. At the university level, university managers can collect data on the resources and leadership they have in place to support student and lecturer development in relation to this capability. Institutions would also need to deliberate across relevant forums, drawing on the evidence sources above, about which students are provided with opportunities to develop the capability and achieve the functioning. Where these opportunities are provided, what the university enablers and constraints are, with a view to implementing change beyond just tick boxes and checklists. So this is just an example of how we operationalize the functioning of being an epistemic contributor, and that universities can also learn from. So with the aim of ensuring more just and equitable student access, participation, and moving on, the book helpfully gives us questions that we can ask and also provide answers on how to answer these questions. So we need to ask what it means for higher education to be sustainable in the face of inequalities and injustices which continue to scar our society and which affect universities as social institutions. We also need to ask how we can begin to imagine a higher education which looks different and which supports a contextual evaluative space for fostering the multidimensional freedoms, human dignity and belonging, and agency that diverse students value during and beyond their higher education lives. Ultimately, we also need to ask how the curriculum and pedagogy can be restructured to foster capabilities and aspirations of students in decolonial human developmental universities. And universities need to attend internally to their own sustainability. If they do that, what would this university look like going forward? And the book offers key pointers to achieving this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patience, and thank you to our authors. You kept well to time. So can we give them a round of applause? Okay, so we've got 3 respondents or discussants waiting. Let me just see if Prof. Boughey is here. Did you see her on the platform? Doesn't look like it, no. Okay.
So she's being load shed.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the other 2 discussants, and then we'll circle back to see if she's there on the platform later on. So, Melis, if it's okay, I'm going to jump to you. So, Dr. Melis Sen is a senior lecturer in education and social justice at Lancaster University. She is a feminist researcher with a particular interest in exploring the relationship between education and international development. And there are 2 current strands of her research. The first one is on gender education and peace in international development, which explores the role and quality of education in promoting gender equality and peace building, and unsettles the normative policies and practices by offering a critical, intersectional and decolonial feminist analysis. And the second stream is participatory arts in international development, which aims to bring together arts and humanities methods with a research agenda on international development, which all sounds very impressive, Melis. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Sonja. And thank you so much for inviting me to share my initial points, sort of insights about the book and so on. And I just want to start saying huge congratulations to author on this open access and much needed book on higher education in South Africa. And I hope to be there hopefully soon. So I just want to start saying that this is an outcome of a 4-year-long project which focuses on the higher education experiences of low-income, rural and township youth, and their learning outcomes and how they engage with what higher education has to offer them. And what is really valuable about the book is that it goes beyond the questions of access and takes a comprehensive approach in exploring routes into higher education, academic, economic and social experiences, aspirations, what students do after graduation, and also an exploration of intersectionality that shapes student opportunities and capabilities. And when you read the book, this gives the audience a chance to reflect on the impact of a higher education process on individuals and draw their own conclusions regard to what extent higher education transformed their identities, their lives, but it also in some cases failed them by its exclusionary structural and pedagogical practices. So what this book does is that it highlights the connection between the education one receives and the extent to which one becomes a full social and political member of society, because an inclusive and quality education enables people's well-being to flourish and their participation in the public and political life. I think the authors raise important questions, what such higher education could be in the context of South Africa, or whether one's educational well-being can only be reduced to quality higher education. And when you look at the narratives in the books, they all recognize these tensions in the relations of exclusionary educational discourses, which of course produce inequalities, and the distributive role of education by telling us about the conditions under which they study and also highlighting the capability to participate in higher education. It also, the book also acknowledges the context, social relations, networks, respect, dignity, recognition, and socioeconomic factors that mobilize the outcomes gained from it. I think there is also something really valuable on thinking on knowledge, skills and capabilities universities should promote for a more sustainable future for students who have accessed higher education against the odds. I think most importantly, the book offers an alternative narrative to the deficit model that victimizes students of working class and disadvantaged backgrounds. And such deficit narratives often underestimate the political agency and subjectivities one holds. And we see in the book that the complexity of student experiences and the intersectionality of different conversion factors create opportunities for students to become political agents through participation that is grounded in their relationship with peers, lecturers, or communities. The capabilities of voice, affiliation, recognition, and an agency concept not only highlights the possibility for the development of students as political agents who can change their lives, but also helps us, the readers, to identify the relationship embedded political subjectivity that matter for individual and collective development and change. So although the book actually makes a significant emphasis on agency, one question I have for authors is that how they understand the making of agency concept in the book as some students flourish to become change actors. And my second question concerns on the concepts of Ubuntu, which comes as an important capability domain among the students. So we might all agree that, Ubuntu is central to transformative and decolonial university project and seems to be highly valued by students. And I want to ask boundaries of Ubuntu, whether it was only seen as forming collectivity beyond its performative aspects, such as care. I think we may again all agree that Ubuntu as a global South philosophy offers a much needed understanding of the ability of care for another or care for each other in the wake of global neoliberal moral failure. And given that there are so many critiques of the concept, feminist critiques of the concept, that it does have a patriarchal baggage, I wonder if Ubuntu as a capability depoliticized the agenda of gender equality in your research, as gender equality seems to be one of the fundamental issues of South African higher education system and student experiences in the midst of increasing sexual violence against particularly female students. And the third point I want to raise is that the book places epistemic contribution centrally and argues how it has been transformative for students' experiences, including increasing their chances to enter in labor markets. And the authors offer a very eloquent conceptualization of epistemic contribution as a capability. And I wonder if this was a collective capability, or how would you understand the relationship between Ubuntu and epistemic contribution as two capability domains? Is there a possibility of seeing these two capabilities as mutually inclusive, given that Ubuntu as a philosophy leads to common and pluriversal subjectivities where different epistemic positions and possibilities are open to discussion or even contestation? Before I give the floor to the next speaker, I also want to say that the book shows the normative value of higher education in disrupting the shift of poverty and inequalities that transmits one generation to another, but also shows that there's so much individual effort of students and the collective support from their networks invested in. And what we see most of the time is that students show an endless resistance to the structural inequalities of higher education system as they engage to transform those structures too. And the book has a lot to offer how vested interests of universities for growth and development, and this is usually economic growth and development, can cut out the students living on the margins of higher education, as in the cases of some students who had to drop out, but also push different stakeholders of the higher education system, including us, the lecturers, to think about the importance of inclusive pedagogies and processes. So there's so much food for thought in this book for every actor who shaped the universities. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Melis. That was comprehensive and short and sweet within time. Can I just check with our authors? Would you like to respond to Melis, or would you like Talita to go first and then respond collectively? Okay. Thank you so much, Melis. Then Talita, are you ready to go?
Yes, thanks, Sonja, and good afternoon, everybody.
Sorry, can I just properly introduce you? Okay, so we've got our next respondent is Dr. Talita Calitz. She's a senior lecturer and a researcher at the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Education in the Department of Education, Management and Policy Studies. Her research interest lies in the impact of poverty, inequality and discrimination on vulnerable students' participation in higher education. She studies the political, structural, environmental and psychosocial aspects of inequality that enable or constrain students' freedom to participate in higher education. Dr. Calitz is a Y2 NRF rated researcher. Talita, welcome, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sonja, and good afternoon to everybody there. It's a pity I can't see who's actually in the room besides Melanie and Mikateko, but it's wonderful to be here. And thank you very much for the opportunity. Oh, thank you. Someone's... Oh, great. Now I can see where we are. Fantastic. So first of all, just to echo what Melis said, congratulations on publishing this fantastic book. And I'm really happy that it's open access as well, which is great. And thank you very much for the opportunity for me to share a couple of my insights. So as I was reading the text and as I was preparing this brief response, I was wondering what kind of word, if any, could capture the essence of the Marato project in the way that I was reading it and its contribution, of course, in this book. And a word that really stuck with me is the notion of spaciousness. I found the text to be really spacious, both theoretically and empirically in the way that the language of the capability approach stretches open boundaries within research practice and in the way that this book has been put together, and of course the broader project. So if we were to ask the question, what happens when we open up the research space in this way? That is the space in which we decide what should be studied, what questions to ask, and where to focus our energy. What happens when we design research to be participatory, justice-based, and relational in the way that this project has? And I believe this book would be a response to one of those questions. So the Marato project and this book addresses some of the most urgent issues facing higher education in South Africa. We are familiar with the sustainable funding and a mismatch between policy imperatives, the many policies that exist for transformation, but yet what we find in practice, these embedded notions of stigma and discrimination, exclusion, that are sometimes seemingly impossible to shift within universities. We know about resource and care deficits, as Melis also alluded to, who are supposed to care for whom and at what cost within the space of the university. And then the complexity of representation and vulnerability in a so-called post-apartheid South Africa and what that means, particularly for Black working class rural students. Yet, so within the space of these complexities, the book responds to inequality and poverty in higher education without acquiescing to the often suffocating language of success outcomes and indicators that we find whittle student experience down into measurable increments. And that is really a wonderful feat. Instead of doing that, a capability-informed framing sets out this spacious landscape in which we as the readers, have the freedom to witness and respond to the complexities of student lives. And I think that's really this very powerful contribution the book makes. In this book, student lives are presented as complex, agentic, while of course also being precarious in different ways. The narratives consider the relational, everyday realities of being poor at university. And things are mentioned like being ignored, being shamed or embarrassed, being anxious, excluded, and overlooked in different ways. And these are all part of the experiences of negotiating belonging and participation in higher education for these students. So for the students in the study, at the intersection of race, class, and rurality, university life is really a longitudinal struggle to negotiate legitimacy, relational connection, identity, basic needs, as Melanie also spoke about at length, which is so important, and then this very tricky concept of well-being. And I think that the authors have done really well in capturing all of these concepts in a justice-focused kind of way. So I found this analysis, their justice-focused capability analysis, to be therefore very spacious in its recognition of complex human lives, students as neither victims nor victors. The students, are not boxed into generational stereotypes or assigned passive roles. Instead, the capability analysis was open enough for future terrains in which students could imagine, aspire, and struggle to become at institutions that have in essence not been designed to enable flourishing for Black working class rural students. This book really exemplifies participatory research that has the capacity to restore spaces, real physical spaces as institutions, but also mental, emotional spaces where dignity, knowledge, and identities can be renegotiated in partnerships with students, as Melanie and her team are doing, who occupy the margins of the university. As such, the book addresses the destabilizing reality of social inequalities, which of course we know lie also beyond the walls of the university, if the university has walls. And the authors do this work really rigorously using mixed method design and their multi-institutional focus. And that really is impressive. The spaciousness of their capability approach also presents a robust balance between what ought to be the type of universities that we would like to see in the future and the realities that currently exist. So the Marato matrix that the authors produced is grounded in student experiences, the silences, erasures, but also agency of Black working class and rural students whose experiences presented so poignantly in the book allow us to imagine the act of walking across these many wobbly bridges into an aspirational yet uncertain future. At the heart of the Marato matrix and the project more broadly is a concern with the material resources that enable or disable participation in different complex ways. And so this analysis is an important part of a broader research conversation, I believe, around how to understand social justice, class, patterns of consumption, and identity in the global South, because I do believe we need contextually specific frameworks for this, and I don't believe we have ones that are quite strong enough yet. And I think this book makes a really important and a seminal contribution to that. This book manages, in my view, to include the whole student with attention to how the material, systemic, and psychosocial are interlinked, but without, and this is very important, getting entangled in the individualist deficit approaches that we risk subscribing in studies on student well-being, wellness, positivity, and there's really a danger of us going in those directions when we try to focus on student well-being. And I think the research team here has done an incredible job of looking at the whole student without going into that kind of limited analysis. And for that reason, I believe this approach will inform future work on repair and reparation in ways that keep historical and socioeconomic factors of the human experience sharply in focus, while also paying attention to the complexities and the invisibility of the psychosocial. And I think they've done an amazing job of balancing those two in a rigorous and a conscious kind of way. I think it is rare for any book, any scholarly book, to reach so widely towards the pragmatic while being so firmly tethered to a well-reasoned, contextually based ethics of justice. And this book does exactly this difficult task. So we are guided in the text through student narratives, as Mikateko shared some of them. And the book's backbone really is the evidence of what happens when individual socioeconomic precarity meets institutions at this historical moment or moments as we continue of post-apartheid history, the slow massification of higher education in South Africa, and then, of course, late capitalist economic systems. So in a context where policy so often falls short of institutional change and impact, and where notions of transformation can so easily become empty signifiers that are recycled and discarded and recycled again, studies like this, the Marato Project, and this book in particular, offers a unique justice-based framework for academic staff, support staff, and university managers, those of us who are working, as all of us are, in the space of the university at different levels. It provides, again, the spaciousness where real alternatives can be enacted. And to this end, I found the different levels of intervention aligned with the capability domains really useful. And I've already started using them in different ways and thinking of different ways to use them within my institution. I think they are really powerful. And although they're also flexible and open, as the authors say. Because these levels and these suggestions and these capability domains are not just another tick box for transformation, where because these suggestions have been crafted with students from the ground up, so narrative to policy, which I believe is a necessary and very important shift for institutional change in South African higher education. So just in conclusion, when research insists on keeping social justice at its center, as this research has done, and when it challenges normative assumptions about whose voices should influence how we teach and do research, the result is a book that truly is rich in its response to the theoretical and embodied mismatch between policy and enacted forms of change that we are seeing and not seeing in higher education. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I just want to say again, congratulations to Melanie, Mikateko, Monica, Patience, and everybody else. And I'm really excited to share this book widely with my colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks, Sonja, back to you.
Thank you so much, Talita. Really concise and lots of fruitful comments for the authors to engage with. I'm still not seeing Professor Boughey on the platform. Is it okay if we move on? Do you want to respond first, and then we'll take a few questions from the floor?
Yeah. Sure. Do you want me to have a go first? Okay, so in terms of the questions that Melis raised, I'm not sure if I've understood all of them, but I think one of them was, how do we understand, how is the making of agency understood in the book? And I think we understand it, we understand agency as emerging and acting both within norms and structures and being part of those norms and structures, but also insurgent against those norms and structures. So I think we try not to think of it in terms of a type binary, which is you either adapt to the higher education system you find yourself in, or you resist it. I think the view of agency we have is much more complicated. And it turns also, of course, on people's own, I suppose, what most of them would call personal capabilities. So their determination, their hard work, their resilience, their perseverance, their aspirations, and so on. And these then work within and against the structures that students encounter both in society and in the university. So that's what I would say there. I didn't quite understand the question about Ubuntu and patriarchy, so it would be helpful if that was, we could come back to that. In terms of the relationship between epistemic contribution and Ubuntu and are these collective capabilities, I mean, in a sense, all of the capabilities are collective insofar as they turn on the ways in which students work together, support each other, hold each other up, pick each other up, and so on. They're certainly relational in all sorts of ways. The issue of whether they're collective turns on that these are capabilities which they would not have been able to achieve except under collective conditions, which I think is true of epistemic contribution to a large extent, and most definitely true of Ubuntu. Are they mutually constitutive? Absolutely. In order to be a confident epistemic contributor included in all aspects of university knowledge and pedagogic relations, you need the kind of relations of care and knowledge and so on, which are fostered by Ubuntu. And then there was something about the normative value of higher education. Oh, I think that was more a comment that higher education is a space in which poverty can be contested, in which students have voices, in which students can resist and so on. The issue is how much does higher education do that? How far does higher education go? And could it be going further? For Talita, I just want to say thank you for an extremely generous set of comments. I kept wondering if you'd read the book we'd written. So I thought it was extremely generous and insightful. I love the concept of spacious and spaciousness, as you say, where real alternatives can be enacted, concepts of complexity, of intersectionality, of justice focus, and so on. I thought it was really rich, and I'm very, very grateful, as we all are, to you for those comments. And it'd be great. I want to talk to you about turning it into a book review for the JHTC, if possible. Okay, but yeah, I don't know if you want to comment. Perhaps you understood better what Melis meant about it.
I'm not sure if I understood better, but I wanted to add what you were saying about the importance of relationality. So I've come to understand Ubuntu, especially the way that students described how they related to each other, as the desire to enter into relationships of care. So they recognized how they were lacking in the kind of support that they needed from home, from teachers in their schools, and then also within the university space. And although they lacked that care, they wanted to give it too. So there's a reciprocity that's important in how they understand care. So on the one hand, you've got them wanting to enter into relationships of care, that's Ubuntu. And then when it comes to epistemic contribution, I think it's again about entering into relationships, but it's entering into relationships of knowledge making. And they tended to do this amongst each other through sharing resources. Like if somebody didn't have a laptop, then they'd share with that person. If they weren't understanding some of the concepts well, they would form study groups through WhatsApp and other informal learning spaces so that they would have that opportunity to kind of exchange and learn better within and amongst themselves if they felt that the opportunity to do so within the classroom wasn't being allowed. So I think there probably is, something to be said about how these two concepts should be looked at more carefully together, particularly recognizing that they're both relational and both require reciprocity in order for them to play out in the way that the students have reason to learn. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about the epistemic contribution in Ubuntu.
Thanks, Mikateko. Can I just check with Patience if you want to add to the comments or to the response?
Hi, Sonja. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the generous comments, Talita and Melis. It was really nice to hear feedback and kind of see how people who read the book would understand it. So thank you very much for that. I'm not sure if I understood the question on gender equality and the epistemic contribution correctly, but based on my limited understanding, maybe I can try to give some sort of response. So we did ask student questions about the the effects of gender, or if gender was a problem that they would identify. And while they identified other problems, gender was not flagged as an issue in the students who participated in the project. But we were cognizant of the fact that issues of gender-based violence are very pervasive in South Africa. And so from this perspective, what students spoke about was more about solidarity and the ethics of care, as Mika said, but not necessarily in relation to gender-based violence. So for them, it was Ubuntu being operationalized through sharing resources, through helping each other, recognizing that students from similar backgrounds might have the same problems. They would go back to their home villages and provide information to students who are finishing their matric and try to share the experiences that they've had so that they would kind of help them adapt better to the university environment. But it was not necessarily from the lens of gender-based violence. I don't know if I answered that question. Thank you.
Can I add to that? Sure. Can I add to that? I think this is a gap in the book, and this is something to be addressed in going back to and working with the data again, is that at one level, gender is very opaque in the data. At another level, if one were to conceptualize the notion of gendered lives rather than, was gender a problem for you at school or at university or whatever, I think that might be a richer focus, because what you do see is concerns, especially among the young women, slightly less so among the young men, but amongst them also, but especially the young women, the challenges they face if they are if they're attending urban campuses and they live far away, and the challenge of leaving before before it's light or getting home after it's dark. And I think that really is an indicator of gender-based violence and the lack of safety in the society. And the other ways in which I think the gendered lives start to come through is that a small number of the women in the project had children during the course of the project, and a small number of the men also had children. But the way in which their lives were affected was dramatically different. So I think there are interesting things to start unpicking. And I think it's fair to say that we've not done that work yet, and we probably should have a go at it, you know, sometime. So, yeah, thanks.
Can I come in? Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you both. Sorry. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Thank you so much, everyone. I mean, just for this, really, comprehensive responses and this really, like amazing book which I have already shared with my students. Yes, actually, that was my comment about gender. Sorry, that wasn't very clear, but I think I got my response as well from Melanie's. From Melanie's response, just kind of, was sort of, referring to what I was trying to sort of unpack here, that the Ubuntu as a philosophy, ethics of care sits quite at the center of Ubuntu. And what I see is that when Ubuntu is engaged as a philosophy in many settings, there's often sort of I think ignorance of understanding how this ethics of care play in it. And it's also, I believe, some cases depoliticizes the gender equality agenda, because if you look into the feminist political economic critiques of it, that there is a lot of critique that is brought to Ubuntu, how it sort of builds on the social reproduction work of women, and how it actually can sometimes sideline women in terms of the ones who did the ethics of care, which sits at the center of the concept. So that was my question, was more related to this, but yeah, I got my answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melis. If I might misuse my position, it will be interesting to hear when you look at your data again from a gender perspective. From our data, it shows that our male students are struggling to much more than our female students in terms of graduating in minimum time. For example, you have 40% of the African female students graduating in minimum time compared to 18%. So it's more than double that our female students, and that's across racial groups, are moving through the system than our male students. So, and that's across other institutions as well. We raised this in the Siyapulela group, and all of them said this is a major issue for them as well. Male students sort of not performing as they should. Okay, so let's get some questions from the floor, in the room, online. If you're online, just put your hand up. In the room, same here. Questions, comments? Go ahead. I wonder if we should use the mic. Let me just. Yeah.
I think it's on now.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation and very rich discussion. I've got two questions. The first is your domains, which I think are hugely significant. And I wondered how, and maybe Talita could also add anything. She said she's starting to use them, but I wondered how you see them being operationalized or put into practice in new ways in the processes, in the higher education processes. And then a second question is to do with the relationality. I'm interested to know whether the students had a thought, an aspiration, or even an expectation of relationships beyond their social cultural groups. I can see the giving back to help others who come from where they came. And I wondered if there was kind of like, it's hopeless to think of any relationship with a different type of student, you know, that somebody else would help them, or that they might be able to teach or learn from a student from a different social-cultural group. I don't know, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think students definitely had aspirations to give back beyond their sort of more immediate circles, whether that circle is demarcated by family or cultural group, or even beyond the villages where they come from, because they talked about wanting to transform their communities. Although obviously we recognize that, particularly for the students who come from rural areas, that community would look quite similar to their own. So if they came from a Tsonga-speaking village, culturally and linguistically, the people that they'd be thinking about when they aspire for a better future would be very similar to them. In the higher education space, I think, for example, Anata's story where she talks about, you know, not knowing if she actually really belonged at university, and she starts questioning, like, what am I doing here? Everybody, you know, these girls are happy, they're at ease, they talk to lecturers, the lecturer talks to them, and I'm completely out of place. She even says she's fooling herself at some point. So I think there's the recognition that there's students who are better off, who are smarter, who are more articulate, that they might have wanted to kind of engage with, but it felt as if the gap between them and those students who were better off was huge, culturally, socioeconomically, and otherwise, that even if they had the desire to kind of enter into those relationships of knowledge making with those maybe who know better, who speak better, it was difficult to kind of cross those boundaries, especially in the beginning of their time at university. As time progresses, you see, you know, people gaining confidence, them recognizing that it's not necessarily the students who have more money who are necessarily smarter, and that those types of realizations kind of break down the boundaries for them to reach out, especially when they know that they can benefit from somebody else who's not necessarily like them. But it was difficult. Yeah.
I'll have a go also at the first one. I think the reality is when these young people come from rural areas, they've got so much to cope with in the university, to find their place, to find a sense of belonging and so on, that inevitably they will gravitate to people who are more like themselves, because they do feel the social exclusions of poverty really quite strongly. And at the one university, one of the urban universities, they do talk about coming up against the intersection of being Black and being working class when they encounter middle class students who they assume that there will be some solidarity across cultural background, but they find that there simply isn't any. And so for some of them, you know, their survival actually depends on forging relationships with people who are like themselves. And very often that's based on ethnicity. So one of the students at Metro spoke about that she had survived a very challenging course because there were a group of friends who'd also come from Limpopo and who'd come from Venda around her. So I'm not sure that conditions at the universities are particularly enabling of students to break out of their particular social and cultural milieu and survive at the same time. In terms of operationalizing the domains in new ways, I mean, I can only talk about this abstractly. It would require an understanding of transformative learning and what it looks like. It would require an understanding and a practice of what Paul Ashman talks about as students developing this transformational relationship with knowledge while they are in higher education. It would require inclusive and care-focused pedagogies. It would require wide and deep skilled university teachers and teaching. And I think, you know, in the book, I think it landed up in the appendix eventually. There are certainly suggestions as to way universities can think about this, But I think it would be hugely demanding of an institution, which is why things like graduate attributes are so much more comfortable, because they don't really require, you can still work with decontextualized students, you can still work in a what Nancy Fraser would call an affirmative way, with the capability set and the matrix requires transformative change, and we know how universities grapple with that, and it may be that it ends up being seen in little slices here and there, which show what the alternatives are. I mean, I'm a great believer in building the university of tomorrow and the university of today in this sort of slow, incremental way.
Thank you very much. We've got Anthony online. Do you want to go ahead, Anthony?
Thank you. Good afternoon, and hearty congratulations to the authors of this amazing book. I actually posted my question in the chat, but I wanted to check with the authors and the contributors to this amazing book. While looking at Black and rural bodies and how they navigate during and post higher education, did you explore further intersectional markers? And I'm particularly interested in students with diverse sexual orientations in higher education. And I wanted to know whether other markers besides these two variables, and how did Ubuntu then enable them navigating through the space of higher education and post higher education? I find that when Black students identify as non-heterosexual, their peers seem to distance themselves, and then the values of Ubuntu become questionable. And you ask yourself, how far would the philosophy and the values of Ubuntu then stretch when it comes to those in need? So did you pick up any of these elements and markers within your study? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I think you've raised a really important question. And the straightforward answer is no, this did not emerge as a focus of our study and our analysis, partly because it's very grounded in the life histories of the students who were part of the project. And it was not raised by them. It might have been that there was something in the spaces that we created through reflection and so on, although there was also, you know, the participatory photo voice project and the digital storytelling project with a small group of students, where it might have been possible for them to raise these issues if they were of concern. So it might be that you need a project which goes in with that as a very explicit focus, and then looks at how it articulates with, as you say, Black and rural bodies. So it didn't emerge as an issue or a feature of our research. So I can't really speculate on how Ubuntu under particular conditions might become rather faint in the face of difference. But thank you, it's important, and you should have a go at study around it.
Thank you very much. So I do greatly appreciate, I've not read the book. My first encounter, I flipped through and tried to follow a couple of things. It seems mighty impressive. One of the things that seems to impress me is this not focusing on deficits of individuals in particular. And to my mind, that has enabled, for example, you to move away from focusing, for example, on first-time entry students. That's one of our significant ways in this country to look at, and maybe internationally as well, to think about students and then to think about success or failure within the system. And then you've been able to disaggregate and identify multiple other factors through the capability I think that's quite useful and impressive. I've wondered in that if it could have been useful, however, to have also looked at other, let's call it personality or individual-centered factors that may in any event look like one of the capability approach, such as Angela Duckworth's ideas in and around grit. I think that there might be some usefulness in exploring that sort of connection. Secondly, and here I'm slightly troubled. And what I did is I went through the book from the index and tried to see where Ubuntu was referenced and how it was referenced and used. And my concern is more or less this, that you seem to have used Ubuntu as a proxy for something else, perhaps to do with care, perhaps to do with building relationships, perhaps with building communities or finding communities, something in that space. The definitions that you've used seem to more or less point to that, but it doesn't seem to be that clear and obvious that those are the only things that Ubuntu does. And I think that that's perhaps one of the issues that was being raised by one of the respondents. So I wonder if it would not be useful for the approach, in fact, to abandon the reference to Ubuntu and to reference, for example, care, ethics of care or something like that. And if through an engagement with them one observes certain references to Ubuntu, then so be it. But it seems to me that there is a premature use of the notion of Ubuntu that may curtail either the idea of Ubuntu in itself, which is not very helpful, or which may curtail or limit your analytic work in any event. Sorry about the long.
Thank you. Sorry, can you just tell everybody who you are? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think we share your concerns with the use of the word Ubuntu or the concept. And I think when we were working with the data, we eventually decided to settle on it because it best captured not only what students were describing, but this notion that their understanding of well-being was that it was impossible for them to see themselves as being well if that well-being was kind of described or operationalized in a very individualistic sense. So their responses to questions around, what needs to change for the university to be better, how they're getting by, how they're surviving, things that were important for them before they came into the university and continue to play a strong role for them to make it. It was clear that they, yes, wanted to be well, wanted to succeed and so on, but they didn't see their success or their well-being as delinked from the well-being of others. And that's why it was important for them to, yes, take care of themselves, make sure that they succeed and they progress and so on. But in many instances, they talked about that as if it wasn't possible to define or see themselves as being well unless somebody else in the process was becoming well through their interaction. So I think we share your concerns, but at the time it seemed like Ubuntu was the only concept that came close to unpacking the way that they understood well-being as being inextricably linked to the well-being of others.
I'll add to that. I think it's a really helpful question because we've been grappling with this recently because what was that seminar that Tendai spoke up at? This is one of our brown bags. I can't remember. Anyway, a colleague of ours in Zimbabwe said he didn't see how Ubuntu could be a capability because Ubuntu was an ethic. So it was something more than a capability. So we've been thinking about that, and we spoke about it again last week. And somebody else said, well, Ubuntu's a way of life, so it could also be a capability, but more than a capability, as you say. I don't think care is what we're looking at. I don't think it's a capability for care. I think that probably narrows it too much, because as Mikateko was saying, you find coming through what the students say, this concern for the success of others. So one of the young women, I think it's Boughey, says, I don't see how you can describe yourself as successful if the people around you are not succeeding as well. And that's more than care in the notion of an ethics of care. It is very grounded in the notion that my well-being is compromised if your well-being is compromised. And I think that's what we see coming through, and the notion of assisting others with you, after you, to have these similar sort of opportunities. So I think it's more than care. I'm not quite ready to take Ubuntu out. I think it does particular work, and I think the book shows that it's not just about it being a proxy for care, but it's open to debate. In terms of the work on grit, I don't have a basic problem with the idea of, well, I do have a problem with the idea of grit. And that's where I've looked at Angela Duckworth's work, and this was some years ago, I have to say, for me, it's very individualized. It's very North American, and it's very much about the individual has grit. And they are then again sort of decontextualized and removed from what it is that enables one person to have grit and another person not to have grit, unless we assume that somehow grit is innate and we're born with it, or we're not born with it. So we work more with notions of determination. We try to avoid the word resilience, always succeed. Of hard work, of motivation, and so on, understanding all of these as manifest in the individual, but socially constructed and dependent on social conditions. But there's definitely a further conversation to be had about it. It would be quite valuable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got one last question, and we've got 2 minutes left. So, Mukwambo, please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. And mine is not really a question, but rather to really congratulate Melanie, Professor Walker, Mikateko, and the whole team for what I think is an incredible account and an incredible way of narrating experiences that are otherwise mostly unheard. And I'm certain that it will contribute significantly to how we imagine and reimagine South African higher education, particularly as it relates to those who are mostly invisible in majoritarian or mainstream narratives. So well done to the team, and I'm looking forward to an in-depth read of the book itself.
Can I just say, shout out to Mukwambo. This project came about because he and I met serendipitously at an event in Joburg, and we had lunch together, and he was telling me about his Tsunami Foundation and the work that it is doing. And I thought, oh, this is so amazing. This is such amazing work. These are such incredible young people. And then again, very serendipitously, the call came out from the ESRC DFID for the second round of funding under their Raising Learning Outcomes, Let's Not Go There program. And this would focus on challenging contexts. And it just seemed a wonderful coming together of this conversation with Mukwambo, the fact that this funding could be worked, I suppose, to the ends of being able to look at this project. And Tsunami Foundation were fantastically helpful to us. They've been friends of the project all the way through, and we enormously value all of their contributions and their fantastic work. So thank you.
Couldn't have ended it better myself. Thank you so much to our authors. Congratulations again. Thank you to the participants for actively asking questions and contributing. Thank you so much for the respondents. Thanks
to our chair.
Thank you. And on that note, we'll see you with the next book.
And there are some refreshments outside.
Maybe just the last handful of books.